Mirrors by Greensearcher, Chapter 14.
Why didn't you tell me?
Adam asked, feeling a sense of betrayal he had never experienced in his company. He sat with his elbows on his knees, fingers interlocked and squeezing tightly as he tried to place the tale he had heard in context with everything he thought he had known.
He looked up slowly. How come they never told me?
He wondered aloud, thinking of his parents and the secrets they had taken with them.
I believe the story brought the king some shame, Sir Giles said.
He had been recruited to relate the tale, given he had been the closest to his father at the time. I'm quite certain he would have told you when you were a little older, Mrs. Potts added, but
he wasn't here to do so.
Not long enough, Adam realised. He fell on the verge of tears. Which was stupid, but it really had been a lot of revelations for one day. He still hadn't fully processed the witch's involvement in Mammon's death, only to find out his father hadn't always been the man he thought he was, and he had been betrothed to another woman, and that the witch had been impersonating her, and that apparently everyone else knew she could travel through mirrors and change her shape, but never felt the need to tell him. Oh, and on top of that, she had actually been trying to separate him and Belle. He let his face fall into his hands and sighed in a tired frustration. A hand tucked itself into his elbow, another set of fingers running circles across his back. He closed his eyes, enjoying the comfort of Belle's touch, while also wondering how in the world she could stand to put up with him and his ridiculous life. We didn't know if it was our place to share your father's secrets, Mrs. Potts went on, and well, in truth, I suppose we didn't want to tarnish your memory of him, love.
Because he caused this mess,
Adam said roughly. Master.
I just need a minute,
he said, rising to his feet. Belle looked at him worried, but remained quiet as he padded out of the room. He wandered the halls absently, a strange darkness filling his heart. He knew he was tired, exhausted truly, and that things might not seem so bad in the morning. But at the same time, he wondered if he could even sleep right now if he wanted to. Adam soon found himself walking down the long aisle of the castle's chapel. The stained glass windows near the ceiling were dim, a bit of moonlight seeping through the painting the floors a pale-coloured light. He sat heavily on the first row, staring absently at the covered altar in the shadows. Strange that he had found himself here, a place that reminded him of his parents so much. It did so especially now, when all was quiet and still. In the early years of the curse, he had come here often, in secret, kneeling in the darkness, praying desperately that he could somehow see them again. Men claimed to have seen angels, hadn't they? Was it so much for a child to wish to see his parents again, just for a moment? Apparently it was, or more likely impossible. Adam huffed, lying back on the bench, staring at the patterned windows above. He wasn't sure what he believed anymore.
Master?
He looked up, started, and looked into the darkness. The flutter of pages on the next bench over caught his eye.
Oh, Father Marius, I'm sorry,
he said as he quickly sat, realising lounging on the pew probably wasn't the most reverent thing to be doing. The old Bible was quiet for a moment.
My son, what troubles you?
He asked carefully. Adam pursed his lips. The cardinal might give dry sermons, but he had actually offered him some good counsel in the past.
I found out about my father, he said quietly, about what he was.
Marius hummed.
You know, he began, some of the best men had less than ideal beginnings. The prophet Paul, of course, is probably our greatest example of this.
Adam hummed.
It takes great courage to abandon those views that you were taught and accept that there could have been a better way, Marius went on. Especially when that means admitting what you have done is wrong. Your father showed this strength more than any man I've seen.
Adam nodded.
I know his past doesn't matter. I know people change. But at the same time, I can't help but blame him for everything that's happened to us,
he said. He clenched his fist, grinding his teeth.
I can't help but feel angry?
Adam pursed his lips.
I'm sorry, Father. I know it's wrong to be angry.
Well,
I admit I would not encourage it,
Marius said.
But I'd certainly rather a man feel it briefly than bury it deep in his heart.
Adam breathed quietly, soaking in these words.
I am angry, he admitted at last, feeling his eyes burn once again. I'm angry at him for getting us all into this mess. I'm angry at him for letting the Enchantress kill Mammal. I'm angry at him for just... He stopped, sucking in a shaky breath. Just giving up and leaving me behind.
Adam felt something drip down his cheeks. He hadn't even realised that he had been crying. He let his face fall into his hands.
I know it wasn't his fault. And I know he didn't want to leave. But he still did, Adam choked out. And it still hurts. Of course it does, my son, Mary said quietly. Of course it does.
Line break. Belle was worried. Adam had been gone much longer than the few minutes he claimed to need, and she was feeling more and more guilty with each moment that passed. What is wrong with me? She thought, chewing her nail nervously. Hadn't I learned this lesson? To ask about his parents' past after everything Adam had already thrown at him that evening? She couldn't think of anything more inconsiderate. She wished she could take it all back. Come, love. Let's get you to bed, Mrs. Potts said. The others had already left. The master will find his way to his own, and we can all talk in the morning. Things will seem better then. You'll see. Belle frowned, but nodded, standing quietly and following Mrs. Potts into the hall. Not much later, she sat in her chemise on the end of her bed, pulling a brush through her hair as she chewed anxiously on her lip. The wardrobe snored quietly across the room, a lone candle illuminating the space. 2 chimes came from the small mantel clock. A moment later, 2 soft knocks mirrored the sound. Belle looked up, grabbing her robe and tucking it on before pulling open the door. Adam stood in the darkness, holding a single candle. His eyes looked a bit paler than normal, bits of red lining the edges. Belle hoped it was only from exhaustion.
Sorry, he whispered. I shouldn't have left.
I'm the one who should be apologising, she said, looking at her feet. I shouldn't have brought up what I brought up tonight. Adam looked puzzled.
What? No, that's not your fault, he said. I needed to know. And if I was to be upset with anyone, it would be Mrs. Potts for not telling me sooner. But, well,
he finally smiled a little.
It's kind of hard to be mad at her for too long.
Belle smiled back. It was true. His fingers were in her hair then, a giant thumb brushing carefully across her cheek. There was that look in his eyes. She had seen it nearly every time they'd said goodnight these past few days. And sometimes during the day when they sat curled up together beside the library hearth. It was a look like he wanted to say something, or perhaps do something, but couldn't. Well, Belle could certainly think of one thing she would very much have liked to do, had he his human form. She brought her finger to her lips, looking shyly away. She couldn't think of such things. Impossible things. He hummed deeper before letting his paw fall to her shoulder.
Actually, I came with a purpose tonight.
Saying goodnight isn't a purpose? He grinned a bit sheepishly.
I meant, 2 purchases, he amended. Can I,
He nodded towards the door. Belle pushed the door open, letting him in. Max lifted a head up as they entered, his happy breath echoing off the walls. Adam set the candle on the dresser and, stepping quietly towards the hearth so as not to wake Madame de la Grande Bouche. He looked up, examining the tall mirror above the mantel, before grabbing each side with his hands and attempting to yank it free. Instead, the mirror remained caught on its hook, knocking the mantel clock from its perch. Belle caught it just in time. Adam cursed under his breath, and she had to stifle a chuckle as she placed the clock back in place. Adam stepped back, scratching his head. This might need to wait until tomorrow, Belle whispered.
But what if she shows up before then?
The wardrobe gave a snort, mumbling something in her sleep before settling back in place. They moved quietly back into the hall. Belle looked back up at Adam. He really did look exhausted, ears sagging against his head, tail limp on the floor. The Enchantress hasn't tried anything so far, she said, attempting to ease his worries. Adam raised a brow. She suddenly recalled the night she had nearly touched the rose and grimaced. Well, anything to harm me, that is.
That almost makes me more worried,
he said nervously, starting to pace the hall, the candle's flame flickering wildly in his hand with the movement.
Things are too quiet. She must be up to something.
But do you plan to get rid of all the mirrors in the palace? Belle asked carefully, trying not to sound too sceptical. I mean, there must be hundreds.
Doable,
Belle frowned. But remember the water's reflection? Like Sir Giles mentioned? Are we to empty every barrel of water? Every cup of tea? She stopped, pondering for a moment. And what about the reflections from all the silver dishes? Adam stopped in his tracks, running a paw through his mane.
Surely she can only come through large surfaces,
he said, turning back to her.
Right?
Belle shrugged. Even with the day's new information, there was still so much they didn't know. Adam began pacing again. He was looking more exhausted by the minute, and she could feel her own fatigue beginning to flood over her. She knew neither of them would be much use coming up with a new plan so late. Had it really been only a few hours ago she had been in Beaumont with Sophie? Adam, please, she said softly. Let's get some sleep.
Yes, you should.
He agreed, stopping and gripping the banister as he stared down at the dark floors below. Belle frowned, wondering if he was going to stay up guarding her door all night. No, she didn't need to wonder. That was exactly what he would do. Belle sighed, though her eyes softened. Come on, you can bunk here tonight. Adam spun around, his eyes growing wide.
Oh, no, I shouldn't.
Are you going to get any sleep if you don't? He pursed his lips.
Probably not, he admitted.
Smiling, Belle reached for his hand and pulled him back inside, shutting the door behind them with gentle fingers. They stepped quietly, careful not to disturb the sleeping wardrobe as they silently gathered back the stacks of blankets beside the fire and made a makeshift bed for Adam on the floor. Neither had to speak to know he would be sleeping beside her bed instead of the hearth. Belle looked at the single bed, suddenly wishing it was enough for two. She flushed immediately, shaking her head at herself. Adam soon tugged off his jacket, setting it aside. Moving to unbutton his shirt, he paused, however, glancing over at her with nervous eyes. She slipped quietly into bed, turning away to give him a moment of privacy. She had seen him shirtless once, that night she had sleepwalked. No, been led into his room. She swallowed, turning her thoughts back to the present as something fell softly to the floor behind her and the remaining candle was blown out. Even now, there were still times Adam seemed embarrassed by himself around her. She wished it wasn't so. A warm, gentle hand resting on her shoulder, and Belle rolled back to face him as he sat beside the bed. She caught his eyes in the darkness, and there it was. That look again.
Belle?
He started, feeling for her hand beneath the covers. Yes? Adam sucked in a breath, then another.
Good night,
he said at last, sounding faintly defeated, or perhaps just tired. Good night, Belle whispered back. Sweet dreams. He chuckled softly.
You too.
Even after he said it, he didn't pull away, but instead rested his head on his arms, fighting drooping eyes as if nervous she might disappear if he shut them. He had clearly been trying to hide it, but the slight trembling of his hand in hers betrayed his fears. The fingers of her free hand reached out on their own accord, running through the long fur on his head, knuckles coming down to brush his cheek. Adam finally let his eyes close, sighing deeply. Soon his quaking was all but gone. Everything's going to be fine, Belle said softly, as much to herself as to him. You'll see. Line break. All was still in the town nestled between the peaks. Though it was a loud and bustling village during the day, the townsfolk of Beaumont had retired early that evening to prepare for tomorrow's holiday market, their most profitable day of the year. However, while all slept, a lone light flared in a small shop near the edge of town. Those sleeping nearby muttered curses while stifling the sound with their pillows, but the loud clanging of iron on searing metal continued deep into the night. The pounding would stop every few minutes, the young blacksmith thrusting the finished blade into the water barrel before pulling out a new one from the fire. Henry wiped the sweat from his brow onto the back of one arm, staring at the new sword in his other hand. It glowed orange in the dark workshop, highlighting the raw edges of the tools around him. He bore a few old burns along his arms from his apprenticeship, but it had been years since he had made such mistakes, for the craft had long since become second nature to him. He sometimes wished it required more focus, however, for it was nights like these he felt the most alone, and nights like these his memories would always come crawling back to him to torment him. Flashback.
All right, lad, you're free to go.
The heavy presence finally lifted from the back of his neck, and Henry stood slowly, body used to the hunched position he had been forced into for the past day. He cracked his neck, rubbing roughly at his free wrists.
5th time in the stocks this month,
the officer observed, raising a brow at the young man before him. Henry only frowned.
What do you expect, Charles? Look, son, I get it,
the man went on, resting a hand on his shoulder.
You aren't the only one who's been trying to get into those woods. But it won't do you any good going against the king's orders. He's no king of mine,
Henry said darkly.
Good Lord, Henry!
Charles said, eyes scanning the crowds around them as he dragged him into an alleyway. He glanced behind him, tensing as a couple of the king's soldiers walked by, but the men continued by without a second glance. The old town officer sighed in relief, looking back at Henry sternly.
You can't say things like that. Why not?
Henry asked defiantly, crossing his arms in the quiet side street.
Everyone knows Victor murdered his own brother for the crown. Demon, my foot,
he huffed in disbelief.
He's just keeping us out of those woods to cover it up. And you know what I think? Not this again, Charles sighed. He's keeping them trapped there because they know the truth,
Henry said fiercely.
Don't want witnesses, you see?
He stopped, glancing towards the distant woods.
But he can't keep me away forever.
Charles's expression fell.
Son, it's been 3 months. Whether those woods really are possessed by demons, as they say, or...
He paused, looking around for a moment before glancing back and lowering his voice.
Or, if you are right, you gotta accept the king wouldn't keep anyone alive if they did have that kind of information.
Bah! Henry said, waving a hand at the man and starting back towards the street.
They wouldn't kill an infant or his caretaker. Are you sure?
Henry froze in his tracks, gritting his teeth. 3 months. The first 2 wasted on business for his master in the south, only to return to find the king declared dead and the woods to the palace guarded fiercely by Rob Victor's soldiers.
Henry, they told us everyone in the palace was dead. Whatever really happened, I see no reason for them to lie about that.
Charles sighed again, grimaced as he looked away.
Your boy's gone, son.
Henry kept his back to the man, fighting the growing moisture in his eyes.
No, he said. He isn't. I can feel it.
Charles only frowned deeper.
Henry, I've known you your whole life. You were a good kid, and you've grown into a good man. But I'm afraid I can't protect you any longer. Victor's soldiers say you venture into that forest once more, and they'll detain you themselves. The town's authorities won't have a say then. You know what that means, don't you?
Henry nodded. A work camp, most likely. Or the gallows if they really wanted to be rid of him.
Son, you're still young. Got a good skill, and your whole life ahead of you. Could find another woman. Settle down. Start a new family, perhaps.
Charles paused, waiting for Henry to say something. He didn't.
Just forget about those woods, alright?
Henry didn't reply. Just looking past him again at the town's edge. The dark forest loomed there, and he narrowed his eyes. Charles sucked in a breath, shaking his head and grumbling under his breath, as he plodded back to his duties. Henry watched him go, then continued towards the edge of town.
There's gotta be a way in,
he thought, pursing his lips as he strode towards the smithy. They couldn't be guarding every path to the castle. There just had to be something he hadn't tried yet. Blast, he thought. I'm a blacksmith, not a strategist. The best he'd been able to come up with was trying to form a group that could force their way to the palace, but everyone he'd asked for was too scared of Victor's army. The cowards.
Oi, Smiles, you reek.
Henry stopped, frowning deeper, as if to spite the old nickname. He didn't have to turn around to know who was there. Emile and his cronies. He had gone to school with them, all marrying around the same time, though these men took their wives and children for granted, wasting their hard-earned money on beer and gambling, wandering the streets causing trouble instead of doing anything useful with themselves. Kids really got you today, eh? Henry furrowed his brows, running his fingers through his hair. It was sticky from the rotted vegetables that the village children had thrown at him while he'd been in the stocks. He probably did stink, though he really couldn't blame the kids. They all did it growing up. How many times are you going to get yourself locked up before you come to your senses? Emile went on.
As many times as it takes to get them back,
Henry said quietly, gripping the gate beside him as he continued to stare at the woods.
Don't know what you're complaining so much about. Got a crying expensive kid off your hands, and what I'd give to get rid of my mother-in-law.
The man smirked to the guffaws of those around him. Henry's eyes grew wide, finally turning to face them.
What did you say?
Emil grinned.
I'm just saying, you should count yourself lucky to be rid of that foreign old hag.
His words were silenced by a fist to the face, knocking the man flat on his back. Henry stood over him, seething. The others backed away nervously.
You're saying I should be glad to lose the mother of the only woman I've ever loved, he said, his voice quiet and rough. To lose the child who's the only piece of a ginny I have left in this world.
Emil was dazed from the hit and looked back up at Henry.
Nah, Henry, that's not what I meant.
That's what I thought, Henry said.
And if I ever hear you speak of Beatrice Potts like that way again, you'll be getting worse than a broken nose.
Emil nodded earnestly, scrambling to his feet, and holding up a sleeve to stop the stream of blood down his face. The others stood in a stunned silence. Given Henry's girth, it was no surprise he could land a blow so easily, yet no one in town had ever seen him harm as so much as a fly. They were probably wondering what had happened to him. Sometimes he wanted the same. Was there really a time he had been known for his playful pranks or his boisterous laugh? He could barely remember the last time he had smiled. End of flashback. Henry blinked, looking back at the sword in his hand. He had let his thoughts wander, and the burning orange metal had dimmed. He set it back in the flames, sitting heavily on a wooden stool. He had managed to smile again, as the years passed, though it was never real, at least not until today. He thought of Sophie, and felt the corners of his mouth curl up. He hadn't felt like this in a long time.
Maybe I can see her in Molyneux, he thought.
He felt his cheeks grow warm. Bah, you're a fool, he thought, standing and yanking the sword back out of the fire once again. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling he needed to find her. And it wasn't just because of that sweet voice, or the way she laughed, or how he found himself opening up to her more than he had to anyone in 10 years. It wasn't even the mystery of who she was beneath that armour. No, it was something else, too. Something deep inside him. He didn't know what it was, but the last time he ignored this feeling, he'd lived to regret it. He was not going to make the same mistake again. Line break. Belle woke to a strange sound. She blinked her eyes open. The fire had burned low, early morning light peeking through the curtains. Madame de la Grande Bouche was gone, which wasn't unusual. She often left to wander the nearby halls. No doubt it was dull to stay in this room so much. The Belle couldn't help but wonder what she had thought at the sight of Adam on the floor that morning. Belle heard the noise again and looked over. Oh dear, she thought, realizing he had never laid back down the night before. The sound was a faint snore as he slept with his head in what appeared to be a rather uncomfortable position on the edge of his mattress. Though he didn't seem to mind. In fact, she couldn't recall ever seeing him look so content. Lying there on his crossed arms, back rising and falling quietly, Max must have made his way over in the night, for he was now curled up against Adam's side and sleeping just as soundly. Belle recalled the night before and blushed, remembering the feeling of his fur between her fingers, the deep masculine sigh that had sounded from his throat as he drifted to sleep quietly. She thought back to when she had first come, and her initial fear at his form. How strange it was to think that she had ever found him frightening. How strange that, instead, he had become the person she felt safest with. It wasn't the feeling of safety one might usually associate with the word, for while she was certain Adam could protect from any physical threat, this was different. It was the safety of knowing she could open herself up to him and not fear judgment or mockery. Beyond her small family, she had never even come close to finding anyone like that. Belle lay there quietly, a strange out-of-body sensation overcoming her, as she realized how much her life had changed. How much she had changed in just a few months. She had experienced both the greatest heartache of her life at losing Mammel, but at the same time, meeting Adam had left her with the greatest feeling of... She flushed as one particular word came to her mind. Her chest burned with warmth, and she suddenly wondered if this feeling were, well, that feeling, the one she'd always read about in novels, but never felt herself. At once she sucked in a nervous breath, falling onto her back, and staring up at the painted ceiling above. She knew she'd care for Adam, and she knew she'd never feel this way about anyone. But at the same time, it was all still so new. Could she really trust herself to know her own feelings yet? At times, she felt wiser beyond her years, at others far too naive for her own good. Right now, it was one of the latter, and she felt her heart racing as her anxiety built. Oh, Mamma, I wish I could talk to you. She dabbed the edge of her sleeve against her eyes, taking a few minutes to push away the fresh heartache. She didn't want to cry over this. Not today. Not with everything else that was going on. Rolling back over, she looked at Adam and managed to smile. He really did look peaceful while he slept. Reaching out a careful hand, she bit her lip in hesitation before brushing her fingertips along his cheek once again. The fur was soft here, softer than she thought it would be. She moved up to his head, and if she closed her eyes, she could almost imagine him as he might have been without a curse, her fingers running through hair instead of fur. Belle grimaced, feeling immediately guilty. She really shouldn't be thinking like that. A low rumble echoed from his chest, breaking through her thoughts. She opened her eyes, but Adam's was still closed. Figuring he was still asleep, she let her fingers brush over his head, bringing them around his ears and over his cheek. Belle heard a new sound, peeking over the edge of the bed to see his long, wolf-like tail brush briefly against the floor before quieting. A wicked smirk crossed over her face, and she backtracked to scratch the spot behind his ear once again. Thump! Belle gasped, pulling her hand away and staring back at the floor. Adam's paw had slammed against the blanketed ground, stopping the tail's movement in an instant. Though his eyes were still closed, it was obvious by his expression that he was now very much awake. He peeked an eye open, looking thoroughly abashed. Just pretend you didn't see that. A laugh bubbled up in Belle's throat, but she barely managed to contain. Oh, Adam, it's all right, she teased. He groaned, burying his face back into his arms. I swear, that thing has a mind of its own. Just then Max sat up, pawing the edge of the bed as if asking for his own scratches. Belle complied, though Adam only glared at the mutt and his wagging tail. You're not helping, he grumbled. Oh, don't be grouchy, Belle chided, grinning at him. You remember what day it is, don't you? Adam blinked before smiling wide. Christmas Eve! He realised with a boyish excitement, tail brushing the floor happily once again. Belle couldn't hold back her laughter this time. Will you just calm down? He told the tail, grabbing it in a rough paw and holding it in his lap. He was clearly trying to remain irritated, but Belle's laughter quickly eased it away, and he was chuckling alongside her. I don't know why I even try to maintain any kind of dignity anymore. He sighed. His eyes seemed happy, though. Belle shook her head at him, sitting up and quickly trying her robe closed. So, what did you get me for Christmas? She asked casually. Who says I got you anything? He replied, finally giving in to Max's nudges and brushing a paw down his coat. Belle gasped. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to assume. You certainly don't need to. I mean, I was only joking. I glanced over at her. So was I. Oh, Adam! He only snickered, which earned him a pillow to the face. His laughter was muffled as it hit him, then died away as the pillow slid to the floor. His expression seemed momentarily dazed, before a mischievous grin crossed his lips. Oh dear, Belle thought, realising her mistake. Before she knew it, he had reached over and gathered her up in the large comforter. She felt not unlike a very tightly wrapped crepe as he pulled her off the bed and into his lap. What are you? Oh, she cried, feeling something tickle her way through the fabric. Oh no, Adam! I can't! As his snickers turned in full force, and for a long minute Belle was so lost in her own laughter. Oh no! She managed at last, completely breathless. Unhand me at once, sir! As you wish, he conceded, still chuckling as his fingers stilled. He stared down at her, still completely at his mercy in her blanket cocoon. His blue eyes gleamed with mirth. I am very cross with you, she declared, even as she smiled ear to ear. Very cross. He snorted. Yes, I can tell. Don't look so victorious. And why not? I finally found a way to tickle you without... He stopped, glancing down at his claws. without hurting me, she realised, noticing the bit of joy fading from his eyes. She managed to wiggle her arms out of the blanket, wrapping them around Adam's shoulders. He seemed to realise that they were still bare, eyeing his shirt across the floor, and swallowed roughly. Belle only pulled herself closer against him. "This is who you are," she wanted to tell him. "It's all right." He glanced down at her, and she wondered for a moment if she'd spoken aloud. But no, it was simply that look. Again! What was he thinking? Whatever it was, that feeling from before had now returned in full force to her chest. Belle suddenly found it hard to breathe. Adam gave her a half smile, before looking away towards a point across the room, towards the large mirror over the hearth. Belle sighed. At least they had had a few minutes to forget about reality. "What are we going to do?" she asked, following his gaze. He screwed up his lips, looking contemplative.
"Well, first I need to talk to someone who knows this place inside and out."
"Don't you?"
"Well, not all of it, exactly."
"You've lived here your whole life, and you don't know what's in each room?"
"It's a big castle," he said defensively.
"Oh, the poor prince lives in a house too large to know all its—" Belle cried as he started tickling her again. "I take it back!" She laughed. "I take it back!" He stopped, looking amused, though she noticed the tips of his ears were turning a little red in embarrassment. Belle hid a grin. "Well," she prodded instead, "who could we ask about—" She stopped, and they both seemed to come to the same conclusion.
"Cogsworth."
Line break.
"This is yet another example of the late neoclassic Baroque period, and as I always say, if it's not Baroque, don't fix it."
Cogsworth and Belle laughed in unison, though Adam frowned. He had heard that joke only about 100 times before.
"Now then, if I may draw your attention to the flying buttresses above the—" "Cogsworth." "Yes, my lord?"
Adam sucked in a deep breath.
"We didn't ask for a tour, we asked for an inventory,"
he said through gritted teeth. His anxiety from the night before had come back in full swing as they moved through the palace. His was reminding him just how many rooms there really were.
"How many mirrors does this place contain?" he prodded.
"Ah, yes, well," Cogsworth said, stopping in place and raising a brass hand to his chin.
"Let's see. There are 349 bedchambers, 112 living spaces, 72 bathrooms, 62 lavatories, the great hall, and of the ballroom, of course."
Adam furrowed his brows, trying to do the math. He had never been very good at arithmetic, as much as his tutor had pounded it into him.
"Then, of course, you must consider the number of mirrors in each," Cogsworth considered. "The bedrooms would have at least one, more commonly two. Wall mirrors, plus typically a standing one, and of course any hand mirrors lying around. And I believe about half the parlours, bathrooms, and lavatories likewise hold one apiece. Plus the ballroom, of course, has 54 separate frames on its own, and the great hall hosts a couple dozen." "Deal."
Adam frowned.
"That's,
1,249, Belle noted. Adam raised a brow in surprise, staring down at her in bewilderment. "I mean, assuming the bedrooms have 3 mirrors apiece," she trailed off, blushing as she caught his stare. "What?"
"Yes, precisely,"
Cogsworth agreed, as though he had come to the same conclusion. Adam seriously doubted it. "We also have other reflective surfaces to consider," Belle reminded him. "Anything flat and silver. The glass vases, standing water, possibly some of the jewellery. The clock faces." Adam stopped, and she and Adam both glanced down at Cogsworth. He looked nervous.
"There are also the windows,"
Adam added quietly.
"At night they create a reflection in the candlelight. That's where she appeared to me yesterday."
"And any time it rains," Belle noted. "We'd have to watch for puddles that form from leaks or from tower windows." They all were silent at that moment.
This is impossible!"
Adam cried at last, running his claws over his head and beginning to pace along the long hall. "Well, of course it is," Cogsworth said, recovering. "Why did you think we never did anything about it before?"
"Maybe because I didn't know about it before,"
Adam thought with some bitterness. It made sense, though. His father knew how the Enchantress could travel, yet hadn't done anything about it either. Had he come to the same conclusion? "There may still be a way," Belle started. She looked up at Adam, thoughtful. Perhaps we don't need to get rid of all the reflections." Maybe we could just remove them from certain areas. Adam's mouth formed a small O.
Like a safe zone,
he realised, starting to smile. Exactly, Belle said excitedly. We can just remove them from where we sleep, since that's where we're most vulnerable.
Yes, that's brilliant, Adam said, smiling wider. You're brilliant.
Belle flushed a bit, though she looked pleased.
We should choose a centralised location,
he thought, thinking quickly. He paced the hall once more before coming back to them.
The west wing. It's the most secure, he decided, looking back down at Belle. I'm sorry, but you'll have to give up the gold room.
She didn't seem upset. It's all right, she smiled, tucking a lock of hair behind her ear.
I can set the night guards around the perimeter and throughout the castle, Adam went on. They can't fight too well in their forms, but they could at least give us warning if the enchantress enters through another part of the castle.
An excellent idea, master, Cogsworth piped in. I'll speak with Sir Giles about it at once, and send the servants to prepare a suite for the mademoiselle.
La suite de la reine,
Adam directed. The Queen's suite. Belle's eyes grew wide, glancing up at Adam. Adam cleared his throat, but only nodded. Besides its grandeur, comfort, and the proximity to himself, there was a more important reason he'd chosen that room in particular. Line break. Belle laid the last of her borrowed gowns over one arm, glancing back at the room to see if she had missed anything. Besides her, Adam stood with a stack of books in his arms that rested under his chin, her satchel swung over his shoulder. Belle grimaced. She hadn't realised just how many books she had gathered in her room over the past few weeks. Will you be coming, madame? She asked, looking up at the wardrobe.
Oh, heavens, no, the woman chuckled. Sorry, dear, but this bulk doesn't scale those west wing stairs like it once did. In fact, after making it down for the festivities tonight, I'll probably be camping out there until... She stopped, her wooden features contorting oddly. She then cleared her throat. Until I, find the strength to make it back up.
Belle nodded, and then ran over and wrapped her arms around her.
Oh, dear girl, she said warmly. You take care. You'll have the master nearby now, right? She winked.
Belle flushed a bit, glancing back at Adam and nodding. Together they left the room with her items in tow.
I've offered to carry her down,
he said quietly, once they were out of the earshot of the gold room.
But she turns me down each time, though I suppose it would be a little odd.
Belle laughed, imagining Adam hauling the large woman down the staircase. That would be a sight to see. They moved deeper into the castle, eventually reaching the stairs leading up to the west wing. They seemed brighter than usual, all the sconces lit and casting away the shadows that usually pervaded the wing. The servants had already been there then. Adam guided her to the left, and Belle started to wonder if they weren't just heading straight for his room. They stopped before reaching his chambers, however, moving into the room just adjacent. Belle's eyes grew wide as they entered. Her old room seemed nothing more than a coat closet in comparison. The first thing she noticed was the windows, 8 of them in a row, spread across one wall, overlooking the open gardens below. The view was framed by the snowy peaks behind. Thick curtains hung on each side that could be drawn shut for privacy. She looked to the ceiling next. A chandelier in a bedroom? Not only that, but this ceiling was painted as well. The art was not limited to the small oval as in the gold room, however, but covered the length of the ceiling and several of the walls. Mainly landscape scenes with a few more cherubs floating between pink-tinted clouds. She slipped off her shoes, feeling the soft plush Persian rug beneath her feet. It was enormous, covering the entire length of the room, which itself was as large as the barn where Molyneux hosted its annual dances. The bed was twice as large as her old one, as well, set in a carefully crafted frame, a tall canopy overhead with rich purple fabrics pulled by golden cords. Adam crouched beside the hearth, arranging her books on a shelf, where he glanced back at her.
Is it all right? He asked.
Belle nearly laughed. I do feel a bit small for it, she admitted. I'm quite certain you could house an entire troop in here. Adam chuckled. But it's beautiful, she said sincerely. She glanced back out the windows, imagining spending some hours reading along the seats beside them, especially the view. Adam smiled, almost as though he knew she'd say that.
We should be able to draw those curtains in the evening to prevent any reflections, he noted. And I'm going to have to take down that chandelier today as well.
Belle looked up. Hundreds of reflective pieces of glass. Yes, that could definitely pose a problem. Adam had stood again, looking carefully around the rest of the room.
Looks like they've already removed other small objects that could be an issue. Sorry it's a bit bare in here.
Belle's mouth fell open. The room was usually even more ornate than this.
I'll have to take care of this,
he went on, standing before a large vanity with a grand hinged mirror on its back. He ducked down to examine its screws.
A basic slot, perhaps a lean wide.
He continued muttering to himself, so Belle went to sit beside the window, gazing out over the grounds. I'm a bit confused, she said a minute later. You said this was the, Queen's room? She asked. For some reason her cheeks grew warm.
He cleared his throat. Yes.
But I thought you slept in your parents' old room.
I do, he said, standing tall once again. But, well, the fact that they liked each other enough to share a room was a bit of an anomaly. Most monarchs of the past much preferred their own quarters.
Oh, Belle said softly. That's a bit sad.
Yes, I agree.
Adam watched her for another long moment, before seeming to come to himself.
There's another reason I chose this room, though, besides the proximity,
he said suddenly, moving back to the bookshelves. Belle followed closely. Adam reached out before pausing and glancing back at her.
You're going to like this, I think.
Sucking in a breath, Belle watched as he pulled a book loose from the middle shelf. But no, it wasn't a book. Only a lever painted to appear so. He stepped back, then gently pushed against the bookshelf's side. It slid away easily, revealing a small door behind it. Belle gasped excitedly. A secret passage!
Adam grinned. Golden.
He turned to the deadbolt, unlocking the door and holding it open for her. Belle peeked inside. It was quite dark, but she ducked into the small opening with boldness. Adam took a bit longer to follow, considering he was several feet too tall for the entrance. The passage had a low ceiling itself, and she felt an old rug beneath her feet. As far as she could tell, there was nothing here in the way of ornateness, though Adam's frame did block most of the light behind her.
Sorry, he said. I don't remember it being so small.
He managed to squeeze past her, and she heard another click and something sliding across the floor, before more light was spilling from a doorway not a few paces away. Belle recognised the large oak bed frame, and a softer glow of the enchanted rose on a small corner table.
My room, he explained, clearing his throat. Each door locks from its owner's side, and from in here. I'll leave mine unlocked, though, in case you need to reach me in this way.
Belle nodded. But why is this here in the first place?
The older monarchs didn't, always want to be apart, he said, wrinkling his nose. But mainly for this.
He went on, opening a third door between the other two. Belle moved closer, looking inside. A tight, narrow staircase descending into the darkness below. Belle's eyes grew wide in excitement. Where does it go? She asked.
Beyond the outer walls, he explained. All of the family rooms have their own connecting passages. My ancestors were worried about attacks and assassins long before our witch came along, he said, huffing a bit of fur from his eyes. Anyway, this would get them to safety if the castle's forces were overwhelmed.
He looked back down at the winding staircase.
Unfortunately, that means my uncle knows all about these tunnels too. They wouldn't be much use if he decided to show up again. They were designed for foreign invaders, not familial ones.
Belle frowned. She'd nearly forgotten about King Victor.
I used to get in loads of trouble for playing down there as a kid, though. Adam went on, smirking. It was supposed to be for emergencies only.
Belle grinned. I can't blame you. I'm tempted to go down to explore right now.
Oh, I wouldn't do that. No one's been down here in years.
He paused, leaning close.
There could be rats.
Belle shuddered. Ah, yes, I'll hold off then. He chuckled.
I'll ask Cogsworth to send someone down there to check it out today. But for now, just know it's in here in case, you know.
Belle suddenly frowned. This was starting to feel very familiar to a conversation they had had in the bunker weeks earlier. Adam, what do you plan to do if she shows up? His expression grew dark. He looked away. You're planning to fight her, aren't you? She asked nervously. To kill her? He inhaled deeply.
From what we've learned yesterday, my father's mistake of letting her escape led only to my mother's death. Probably his, and my entire household being cursed, he said at last. I'm not one to seek revenge, Belle. But if she threatened you, or any of the others, then yes, I would kill her.
Despite the conviction with which he spoke, he seemed troubled, as though the two parts of his nature were at war with each other. To his protective side, this was clearly the right path. His gentle nature, however, was obviously straining at the idea. For Belle's part, she felt less concerned with any morality issue than with how he could manage the task without being cursed further, or even killed himself. She felt her heart fly into her mouth at the thought.
I'm not a child anymore, he said almost to himself. I'm not defenseless like I was when she first came. I will protect the people I love. He stopped. The people I care about. No matter what.
Belle only nodded. She couldn't argue with that. She would just have to hope that they were being paranoid, and that the enchantress would never show up at all. Something, however, told her that was wishful thinking. He shut the door to the stone well and then his own, leading them back into her room.
You can always just use that place simply to hide inside, you know,
he said. I sense you speak from experience. He let out a laugh, dispelling some of the tension.
Yes. I'm afraid I wasn't very fond of dinner parties as a child.
And why not?
Well, I had to wear these stupid shoes that pinched my toes. And listen to old men talk about land treaties.
He made a face.
I hated it.
Belle suddenly imagined the boy from the portrait at the table, surrounded by noblemen, trying not to look utterly bored as he attempted to slip off his shoes without being noticed. Somehow it was no longer difficult to imagine that child being Adam.
Sacre-bleu, it's already past noon,
he was saying. Belle looked up, following his gaze out the west-facing windows where the sun was just coming into view.
He looked back at her. I, have something to do.
Something to do with Christmas? He smiled a little.
Maybe.
As he left, Belle turned to look back at the room, taking another look around. Her eyes caught a tall cream wardrobe just near the bed, though this one did not greet her. She felt a pang of loneliness. She had light scratches against the floor of the hallway. Max soon ran inside, sitting beside her and pawing at her leg. She crouched beside him, glancing back at the wardrobe. Shall we see what kind of things a royal would wear? She asked. Max gave a short bark and Belle stood, moving over and pulling open the tall cupboards. She braced herself for the moths, but none came. It seemed that these clothes had been tended to over the years, despite their disuse. The first gown was made of a bright red silk, trimmed with golden thread in intricate patterns along the sleeves and bodice. Beautiful lace trailed the bust, and careful ruffles graced the hem. The next was a deep violet, covered in blue floral patterns, with a long train carefully folded behind it. Belle had never cared too much for fashion. It was an expensive taste, and frankly, the less attention she drew from Gaston, the better. But she couldn't help but look through the remaining gowns, in awe at the detail put into each pattern. She had never realized clothing could be so much like art. Do you think they wore these every day? She wondered in amazement, glancing back at Max. He only cocked his head at her. She was about to shut the wardrobe once again, when something bright caught her eye in the back. She pulled back the dress in front of it with some effort. They were quite heavy, especially with the bulk, and managed to slide the remaining gown free. Belle's breath caught in her throat. Silk, in the exact honey-yellow colour of sunflowers in the summer. It was a colour that reminded her of days spent atop her father's shoulders, hands spread wide and fingertips brushing the soft petals surrounding them. Of days walking through the fields with Maman, hand in hand despite the dirt coating their fingers, sprinkling water over the dry ground. Belle closed her eyes, and she could almost feel the sun's warmth, see her mother waving at her from between the tall sunflower stalks. Hear her parents' laughter as she raced to catch up with them. They were happy memories, some of the happiest that she could remember, and even more precious to her now. She brushed the moisture from her eyes, looking back at the gown with fondness. Strange, how a simple dress could make her feel this way. The gown itself seemed to glow in the sunlight now streaming into the room, and Belle couldn't help but hold it against herself and give a spin in the middle of the large rug. She came to a stop a few minutes later, however, laughing at her childishness as she moved back to the single remaining mirror for a better look. In a way, it was simpler than the other dresses. No vibrant patterns across the fabric, no large sleeves or long trail that would drag across the floor. although it felt lighter than the others. It had its own full, round skirt and soft ruching, trimmed with satin waves. The sleeves were short and loose, meant to frame the shoulders. Belle held the gown to her own shoulders, suddenly wondering what it might be like on. She had never worn anything like this before. She quickly shook her head. "No, I shouldn't," she said to herself, resisting the temptation to try it on. "People like me aren't meant to wear such things." People like her weren't even meant to wear the fine dress she was currently wearing. Still, the sight of this new gown had lifted her spirits. "Come on, Manx," she said, hanging the dress back up in front of the others and shutting the wardrobe doors with care. She grabbed the satchel and headed towards the door. "I still need to wrap Adam's present." Line break. "Try to keep them close together, sweetie." Chip jumped rim first into the dough, before hopping back upright onto the countertop. "Like that, Sophie?" he asked, dumping the circle out of his cup and onto the tray awaiting to go in the oven. "That's perfect! Maybe you'll grow up to be a baker." She chuckled, pulling the remaining cookie dough off the batter, mashing it back into a ball, and starting to roll out a second sheet. "Nah, I'm going to be a blacksmith, like my papa," Chip said proudly. Sophie froze. "What did you say?" she breathed. "Mama said he made lots of things people needed, like horseshoes and tools, and even swords." He paused, thoughtful. "Though I'll have to figure out how to do it without hands." He laughed. He grew serious once again. "Do you think I'll melt?" "I'm not sure," Sophie said quietly, still taken aback. She had never even heard the child mention his papa before. As far as they all knew, Chip's father had abandoned him with the curse. What else could explain why he never came looking for his son? "Mama only told me about him because I asked," Chip went on quietly, porcelain rim raised in what could only be interpreted as a shrug. "I guess he doesn't like us very much, though. Mama doesn't like to talk about it."
"Had a little boy, but I lost him soon after his mother. Been over a decade now." Sophie stood still in place, staring at the rolling pin in her hands. Henry's story suddenly seemed familiar. Too familiar. But how could someone like him have abandoned his son? He seemed so heartbroken when he mentioned his loss. Or perhaps what she had perceived as heartache was actually guilt. Sophie could have sworn she felt her heart sink inside her chest, setting the rolling pin down and wringing her metal hands together as she stared out of the kitchen window towards the forest beyond. Could she really have misread Henry so badly? She shook her head. Surely it was only a coincidence. Though, just in case, she knew she'd probably find time to speak with Mrs. Potts very soon.
"Sophie, are you okay?" She looked back down at the little boy on the counter. "Of course, sweetie. Just checking to see if Papa Noel is here yet," she fibbed. Chip laughed. "He won't come until we're asleep, remember?"
"Oh, that's right. How could I forget?" "Sophie?"
She looked up. The master was bounding down the stairs, nearly knocking his head against the low ceiling at the bottom as he moved towards them. "Hi, master! We're making sabelle bretons for you and Belle," Chip said eagerly.
"Oh, yum," he
said quickly before looking at Sophie in earnest. Figuring she knew what he wanted, Sophie turned to Chip.
"Think you can cut out the rest?"
"I'll be right back," she promised. "Okay," he said, jumping rim first into the dough. Sophie followed the master out of the back door and towards the workshop. Once they were inside, he turned around, biting his lip in anticipation.
"So, did you manage to find anything?"
he asked. Sophie sighed dramatically. "I'm sorry, master, but what with everything that happened—"
"Oh," he said, shoulders sinking in disappointment. It's okay."
"Just kidding," she said happily, twisting off one metal hand and letting several dozen tubes of oil paints fall onto the workshop desk. From the other, half as many brushes spilled forth.
"Yes!" he cried in excitement.
Sophie chuckled, pulling off her helmet and digging out the flat wooden palette and small box, locked with a metal knob. "These are watercolours," she explained, opening the box and revealing 2 rows of solid paints and several hollowed-out spaces for mixing. "Considering neither Sir Giles nor I knew what we were doing, we just got some of everything," she shrugged. The master was only half listening, arranging the supplies in neat rows along the countertop and grinning from ear to ear. Sophie chuckled. "You're so big, master. Sometimes I forget. You're still just a kid, huh?"
"Hold on now. I'm 20 years old."
"Like I said." He huffed, though the smile didn't go away. Sophie glanced at the easel in the corner. which looked like it was just missing a final prime before it was completed. Speaking of which, she went on slyly, you should have seen all the boys after Belle in Beaumont. Must have been 24 of them vying for her.
Wait, what?
He said, looking up nervously. Oh, don't worry, Sophie assured him. Belle wouldn't have any of it. Turned them down flat. She laughed.
She did?
He said, ears starting to perk up. Well, sure. She's with you, isn't she?
I guess,
he said, scratching the back of his neck and looking away.
There are real men who want to be with her, and she still...
Chose you? Sophie prodded. Well, of course, master. Did any of them build her an easel? He let himself smile a bit.
No, he admitted,
a hint of pride in his eyes as he glanced at the gift across the room. Besides, you're a real man too, and don't forget it. The master raised an eyebrow at her.
I thought you said I was a kid.
Line break.
You need not worry, my lord,
Giles said, securing to Adam's waist as they moved across the halls near the west wing.
We'll have men at every corner of the palace. You should have plenty of warning of any intruders.
Adam nodded, moving down the stairs. Several of the guards were already in place, the others coming into position the following night's festivities. They had already done one sweep of the corridor where he and Belle would be sleeping, ensuring no reflections remained that could pose a threat, though Adam still felt certain he wouldn't be sleeping well from here on out.
Sir Giles?
He asked a moment later.
Yes, my lord?
Adam frowned, glancing around and finding a present empty hall. Adam frowned, glancing around, and found the present hall empty.
Belle mentioned a tale that the enchantress told her, he stated quietly.
Giles was silent for a moment.
Master, well, it is certainly not a story one would wish to repeat.
Adam frowned.
I would wish to hear it regardless,
he said. The man sighed.
As you wish, my lord.
As Adam related the tale, Adam grew nauseous, suddenly wondering if he should have heeded Giles's warning after all.
My God, he breathed as Giles finished. I would never!
Of course, my lord. Knowing the witch herself had woven the tale, Adam could have been rightfully angry. But instead he felt a sudden fear, images of a murderous monster filling his mind, images of himself thrusting his claws into... He shook his head, swallowing against the sick feeling in his mouth, and stared down at his paws.
The enchantress. She did say...
Adam paused, biting his lip. He hadn't told anyone this before, but decided to go on.
She did say I might become more of a beast over time, he admitted.
Surprisingly, the swordsman appeared unfazed. And
have you, my lord?
Have I, he asked in confusion,
become more of a beast?
Giles clarified. Adam felt his chest swell with a sudden confidence.
No, he said firmly. No, I haven't.
And there you have it, the man concurred. He thought back to the tale he just heard. The tale Belle had heard.
Belle heard that story. And she came back?
He asked, obviously knowing the answer, but was still in shock that it was really true.
Yes, master, the man replied warmly. It seems you need never doubt her trust in you.
Adam smiled, breathing in a deep breath that warmed him from head to toe.
You know, my lord, Giles went on, as much as I have always wished for this curse to end, I never truly thought there was someone out there worthy of you, he admitted. And I know I am not the only one who thought so.
Adam looked down, raising his eyebrows in surprise.
Master, you must know how we all care for you,
the man said quietly, almost nervously.
After all these years, well, many of us feel as though you were truly our own,
Adam realised. He ducked his head.
I know, he said simply.
I feel the same.
Ah! Well, as it is, Giles went on, it seems I was wrong. That girl, well, I never did have children, you know, but I'd adopt her in a heartbeat.
Adam chuckled.
You're going to have to fight Maurice for that job when he returns.
Line break.
Oh, wow.
Belle paused, her bedroom doorway half shut behind her. What is it? She asked nervously.
Nothing, Adam said quickly.
looking back at her for another long moment before glancing away.
You look beautiful.
Belle flushed brightly, trying to hold back a smile.
I mean, you always do, he said quickly, but I mean, in a Christmassy way.
Belle laughed a little, unable to tame the warmth in her cheeks. In truth, she had put some extra effort in her appearance tonight. It was Christmas Eve, after all, and her first one spent with, well, with someone special. She wore one of the nicer dinner gowns, a deep red in an open robe style, revealing a golden underlayer. Sophie had even offered to do her hair, which was pulled into an updo, a thick braid crossing just behind her hairline, a couple soft waves let loose beside her ears. You look very nice too, Belle told him.
Adam rolled his eyes. Oh, bother.
You do, she insisted. The green suits you. He ran a hand over his head, glancing away, sheepishly.
Thanks.
Though I might be a little biased, she went on. I did help Violet with a lot of that stitching. Adam looked down at his jacket, then back at her.
You did?
Well, I do still try to make myself useful sometimes. He looked almost amazed.
Thank you,
he said sincerely. He offered her an arm, and they made their way happily down the west stairs. Belle smiled wider the further they went. The banisters throughout the palace were wrapped in garlands and ribbons, hundreds of colourful candles lighting up the corridors. A few leapt from their places as they passed, following them down to the library. Belle's mouth fell open as they walked inside. Every inch of the room was decked with greens and golds, even up to the highest banisters. The tree's candles seemed to sparkle against the tall windows, and it looked like the entire staff had already gathered for the celebration. The women had ribbons tied around them in elaborate bows, some of the men with small twigs of holly secured to their surfaces with bits of string reminiscent of boutonnieres. The large hearth roared with life, and a long table spanned the one side of the room, filled to its edges with gourmet dishes. These apparently were meant to be consumed by 2 people. Did Chef Bouche think he was feeding an army? Belle whispered nervously, suddenly wishing that she had skipped lunch.
It's all right. I can handle it, Adam replied. She caught him licking her lips as he eyed the dinner table hungrily, and laughed. They filled their plates themselves. Adam had told her earlier that it had been customary, before the curse, to let the servants off for Christmas Eve supper, so no footman came to help them dish up. And even though it was just the 2 of them, he seemed reluctant to break tradition. Belle was happy for it. It made things feel more like her own celebration back home, and seeing everyone else chatting happily around the room gave the evening a pleasant familiarity. They soon found their seats along the edge of the room, feasting happily on their meals as someone struck up a fiddle. Belle looked up a second later. 2 of the coat racks filled the room with bright, festive music. It wasn't long before a dozen plates were spinning joyfully in a circle in the centre of the room, each partnered with a candlestick or one of the men from the stables. It was much like a country dance, no doubt inspired by one, and Belle soon found herself clapping along happily to the music. Mon amour,
she heard, looking over to see Lumiere bowing gracefully to Fifi, who giggled happily and followed him out to join the others. Belle glanced over at Adam, who was just sitting back beside her with his 3rd plateful.
They did this before the curse too,
he said, watching the others pleasantly before returning her gaze.
I used to come and watch. I always thought the country dances looked like fun.
So, do you know any? He shook his head.
Sorry.
It's all right. I don't either.
He furrowed his brows. You don't?
Well, usually you learn them at the village dances, but I've only been to one. Adam still looked confused, and Belle sighed. She hadn't meant to bring this up tonight. It was just... you-know-who sort of took most of the fun out of it for me, she admitted. In truth, Gaston had practically forced her to be his partner for the first 3 dances, and being younger and less assertive at the time, she had claimed fatigue to avoid him for a 4th. Which meant, of course, she couldn't stand up with anyone else. She had returned home early that evening, and avoided all the village dances thereafter. It hadn't been worth the tears of disappointment. As expected, Adam looked angry, glaring out of the dark window as his nostrils flared. Belle shook her head. He seemed to get more upset over Gaston than she did. It's all right, though, she went on warmly. Papa and I would just waltz around the kitchen instead. Adam seemed a bit placated by that, looking back over at her.
Now there's a dance I know,
he said. Belle brightened. You do?
Ahem, 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 ahem.
The music stopped, a few dishes spinning out their twirls as the eyes fell towards the door. Cogsworth stood there, looking unusually pleasant, a sprig of pine secured onto one brass knob. "Come, come, everyone to the chapel," he directed brightly, ushering the crowd through the door. Adam set his plate aside, standing and offering Belle a hand. She slid her fingers through his, sucking in a nervous breath as they moved out the doors with the others.
Belle, are you all right?"
he asked, looking down at their hands as they moved through the candlelit walls. Belle came to herself, realizing she had been squeezing his hand much more tightly than she had meant to. She forced her fingers to relax. "Oh, I'm suddenly getting nervous." He cocked his head.
"Nervous? For what?"
Belle smiled back a little. "You'll see." By the time they reached the chapel, the pews were packed, the room glowing with living and inanimate candles alike, the windows lining with greenery, and pleasant carols coming from the old organ.
"Now, Monsieur Lumiere,"
the old Bible spoke while Belle and Adam managed to squeeze into one of the front rows.
"I realize that it is a festive time, but I would remind you that we are in the house of God."
"Of course, mon père," Lumiere said absently, giving an exaggerated wave towards the organ. The woman burst into several strong chords of an upbeat carol. But what is La Veille de Noël without a little music? Laughter filled the air, and was soon replaced by the joyous of Fum, 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 as the old organist began the first verse. Belle smiled wise as she sung along herself. She glanced at Adam, catching his eye. "Won't you sing tonight?" she asked hopefully. He shook his head, leaning down to whisper in her ear.
"I already told you I sound like a dying animal."
"Oh, I'm sure you're just being dramatic," she sighed. He pouted a little, reaching for the side of her songbook and grumbling something that sounded very much like
"I'm not dramatic"
under his breath. He cleared his throat, picking out a few of the bass notes for the next verse. To Belle's surprise, he actually could carry a pitch quite well. True, the notes were a bit growly, perhaps, but beneath that they rang true. She reached for his hand and smiled when his voice gained more confidence. "Footmen!" Lumiere called out several carols later. A dozen candlesticks shot out of their seats, joining him atop the pulpit and starting the bold arrangement of O Veni Emmanuel, which was met with the applause and clinking of plates as the wooden handles were pounded against the floor. "Mademoiselle, I believe it is your turn, no?" Lumiere asked, taking one last bow before turning to Madame de la Grande-Bouche and Belle both in turn. Belle sucked in a breath, pulling her free hand free from Adam's as she stood. He looked surprised, but quickly smiled as he realized why she had been nervous earlier.
"Ready, dear?"
the large wardrobe whispered as they moved up to the short steps and turned to face their audience. Belle looked out over the crowd of animate objects. Her friends, the people she had known for but a few months, but already felt like her family. She looked shyly at Adam, who was now grinning in excitement. She smiled back, feeling emboldened as she turned towards the organist and gave a nod. The introduction notes rang out across the tall ceilings. Belle took a deep breath and sang. "Now, guys, I'm going to say the carol, and while I do speak a bit of French, I can't sing it very well, and I don't know every word, so I think I can read most of this, but cut me some slack if I don't. Un flambeau, Jeannette Isabelle, un flambeau, 40 de Bakou. C'est Jesus, bon gens du amour. Le Christ est né, Marie appelle." Beside her, the Madame joined in her rich vibrato, adding a beautiful harmony to Belle's light, clear notes. "Ah, ah, que la mère est belle. Ah, ah, que l'enfant c'est beau." Belle's confidence only grew throughout her following verses, and she felt her heart racing as they finished. The room broke into cheers, the noise of which was most certainly making the old cardinal cringe. Belle felt her cheeks glowing, and she gave a small curtsy and moved quickly beside her seat. Adam's arm was around her in an instant.
"I was right," he breathed.
"Right?" she asked, trying to tame the shaking in her hands as she finally glanced up at him. He looked right at her, eyes soft in the dimming candles around them.
"You are an angel."
Line break. The candles began to burn low during the mass that followed, and Adam felt a peace in his heart that he hadn't felt since the Christmases of his childhood. Belle leaned against him, beautiful as ever, hand growing loose in his as her eyes fluttered shut. Cardinal Marius's voice drifted through the chapel, echoing off the high ceiling as he ended the verse and let his heavy pages fall shut. The others began to file away in a tranquil silence, and Adam gave her hand a squeeze. "Oh," she breathed, looking a little dazed.
"Ready for bed?" he asked warmly. "I heard Papa Noel won't come until we're upstairs."
Belle laughed quietly, sitting up and looking around. "Speaking of, where's Chip?" A quiet clanking against the floor answered her. Sophie stood from between one of the pews, cradling a small sleeping teacup in her hands as Mrs. Potts hopped along beside her. "We've got the little one," Sophie whispered. "I think we managed to wear him out." Adam smiled. Chip might be getting a little old to believe in Father Christmas, but most of them hoped he wouldn't figure it out any time soon. Given the boy and all those around him had been touched by magic his whole life, perhaps Chip didn't see anything peculiar in the idea of a man who could deliver gifts around the world in one night. Adam stood, helping Belle to her feet, as they trailed behind the crowds as everyone made their way through the quiet castle. The palace guards were in a place for the night, an assortment of spears and swords in position along the halls, and surrounding the perimeter of the west wing. Sir Giles himself rested at the base of the stairs, Handel bending in a quiet nod as the young couple made their way up the stairs. At Belle's new bedroom door, Adam stopped.
"If we were married, we wouldn't stop here," he realised, heart starting to race.
He glanced towards his room at the end of the hall, imagining what it might be like to lead her there, to climb into bed together and hold each other throughout the night.
He sucked in a nervous breath. "If you just tell her how you feel, that could happen," he told himself,
pursing his lips and looking back down at her. Surprisingly, she looked nearly as nervous as he felt.
"Belle," he asked, "are you all right?"
She glanced back up, towards the ceiling, biting her lip. Yes, she said shyly, bringing up a hand to the back of her neck before casting her eyes aside. After a moment of hesitation, she motioned for him to come closer. He leaned down, wondering what it was she wanted to say in his ear. However, instead of a whisper against it, Adam felt something soft pressed against his cheek. Joyeux Noël, she whispered quietly, eyes burning as she escaped into her room. Adam stood dumbfounded. He raised a paw to his cheek, slowly registering what had just happened.
"Was that a kiss?"
he wondered in shock. Unbreathing, he looked up, eyes catching something green hanging above them. A twig of mistletoe hung there, secured to the doorframe with a red bow. That had definitely not been there when they had gone downstairs that evening. Adam managed to hobble to his room, shutting the door and padding slowly towards his bed. He paused, then fell heavily onto his back, staring at the canopy above. He laughed, grinning ear to ear, then laughed again, burying his face in one of the pillows and finding it quite impossible to sleep for a long time. End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that, because that chapter is beautiful. And that little bit was Sophie starting to put the pieces together that Henry is Chip's dad. Okay, I'm looking forward to seeing how that pans out. And of course, all the Christmas stuff. And this is only Christmas Eve. But guys, can I tell you something? Aside from my birthday, Christmas for me is the best time of year. There is so much magic in the air. I know a lot of people don't like Christmas or simply don't celebrate it. I won't judge you if you do or if you don't, or any of that. But for me, Christmas is a lot more than just the presents, though admittedly I won't complain. It's about the feeling of it. All of it. The family, the friends, the food, the music, the decorations, the clothes. All of it. That feeling in the air. It's the closest thing I've ever felt to magic. Which I know sounds corny, but it's true. And, well, let's just say I'm very much looking forward to the next chapter as well. I hope you guys have a good day, night, whatever time zone you're in. Remember to like, comment and subscribe, yada yada yada. Take care, my guys, gals and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Bye!